and this is the Game of Thrones work environment, so AKA the toxic workplace.
That toxicity of politics and communication sucks, and everybody is just out for themselves and doesn't feel like a team. That's mainly what we're focusing on.
Welcome to another episode of This Is a Way with Artin and Michael. Now, I don't know if you've experienced this, but if you ever go into the workplace and it feels a bit more like you're in an episode of Games of Thrones or maybe in Parks and Recreation, it might be a time to get out of there. And today we're going to talk about 5 situations that include the 2 I just mentioned that you want to be very careful of and you want to avoid in order to not get stuck in a soul-sucking, dead-end job that slowly devours your life. I don't know how you felt, but for me, one of my worst fears was getting stuck in a dead-end job. It actually was the thing that I don't want to say kept me up at night, but at different points, I couldn't help but wonder and fear that, like, what if I was wasting my time too long in a role that I needed to do? Did you ever experience any of that?
For sure. I think the old school mentality of stay in a job for long, collect the pension, all that stuff never sat right with me either. I always had this urgency of life is short, and kind of just at a young age seeing family members pass away at a very young age from an adult perspective always gave me this point of view that what if I don't make it? I mean, if I'm just living to retire, then I'm wasting a lot of time. So I always had that urgency to keep pushing forward and never feeling like being stuck. As long as there was hope for something, I kept going. But I have to admit, I probably did stay certain places a little too long too.
Yeah. No, I absolutely experienced the same thing. And hopefully what we're going to share today, it is 5 things that we've identified. Maybe there's more, so we'd love to hear them below. But the 5 sort of scenarios, we tried to give them a little bit of a fun, sticky appeal, but for people to look out for on their own. Because for us, I think we had to learn and go through these experiences to really realize what we were actually living through or sitting in. Because again, like you had described, for me, I'm not one of those actually who wanted to be in the same position forever. In fact, when some people are like, congratulations, you've been there 30 years. For me, that's not appealing. It actually scares me because I don't feel like then I'm growing and moving enough. And for people who are okay with that, that's perfectly fine. But that's just my own personal feeling for whatever reason that I've connected with that, my own invisible, script, if you will. So, but all right, so let's dive into these. I'll start with the first one here. And this is the Game of Thrones work environment. So AKA the toxic workplace. So this is that scenario. I think you could see it in a few different ways, but there's usually poor, communication. There's a lack of teamwork. It's, culture that makes you dread Mondays. It's horrible for individuals who come Friday. They're like, yay, it's, Friday. Oh my gosh, thank goodness. And then they enjoy Saturday a bit, but as Saturday starts to go away, they're already like, oh, but tomorrow's Sunday. And that now means that Monday is just next day away. And then Sunday they can't enjoy because Monday's coming. Like, that's probably somebody who's in one of these Game of Thrones.
They're probably feeling some real anxiety too, especially as it comes Monday, debilitating anxiety where they just don't want to even get up.
Absolutely. And I think this is where, again, Game of Thrones fits perfectly well, because for anybody who hasn't seen that, let's just say, you were constantly worried about your survival, and you never knew who was going to come out on top. You never knew who you could trust. Like, that's just not a healthy place to be.
And I would say that a workplace that's just on steroids when it comes to politics is a toxic workplace. Because if you're spending most of your workday just battling politics and playing that game, then you're just playing politics and you're not doing the job.
And again, back to it, that's exactly what pretty much Game of Thrones was. And so I think for myself, I've had an experience. I've been fortunate that I haven't probably been in the worst of some of these situations, but an experience that I did have earlier in my career, I worked at a place for about a year. And in that year, the department had around 11 people, and it literally went through in that year 12 people. Now, when people first hear that might think, well, wait a minute. So literally everybody left within that year? No, some people just left twice, or some roles left twice. So there were still like a few people who were there consistently, but that's the environment that it was. And in fact, I think I've shared the story before. I remember at one time the head of the department actually having her assistant throw a flower plant, a planter at her, and it shattered on the back wall. And the head of the department actually at the time, she just laughed. She thought it was hilarious. She loved it. Basically, she was okay with this type of environment. And that was in her mind just how they functioned. So for me, that is that sort of, Game of Thrones work environment that I've experienced. And I think one thing to point out that sported with it is that was a single department. The rest of the departments weren't necessarily the same way. So you can have this just within your own little, fiefdom, if you will, in the workplace. So Art, I'm curious for you, have you found yourself in any of these Game of Thrones environments, or have you been pretty fortunate?
I would say I've been pretty fortunate most of the last 20 years. I would, the only small time frame that I would say it got very hectic was when I was at Disney, and Disney acquired Fox. So you have a completely new company coming into another company, different cultures, different set of beliefs and philosophies. And for about a year, that created a semi-toxic, overly political workplace, just because everybody knew that, hey, you put two companies together, there's going to be a lot of redundancies. So there's going to be layoffs. Everybody was just in it for themselves. Most people, I don't want to say everybody, most people were in it for themselves.
Fighting for survival.
Yeah, it was survival. And I would say that was the only period that it just felt semi-toxic. But luckily, I've never felt a truly toxic workplace.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. So in this scenario, if somebody is facing this particular type of work environment, what should they do?
Well, I think the easy answer is leave. But I know that's not always, it's easier said than done. I think what someone should do is, if the toxicity is not caused by their boss, have a conversation with them and make sure they are aware of what you're feeling and how they can help. And it could be help of, let's move you to a different assignment, give you some new responsibilities that avoid dealing with certain people. You can also try to move across divisions or departments if you work at a big corporation. But at the end of the day, you're probably just delaying the inevitable, which is, you got to find a new role, a place where you feel yourself, your authentic self, and are able to do your best work. Because that moving around and getting new assignments, new responsibilities, avoiding people, to me, kind of feels like a Band-Aid and not really attacking the root cause. And what I've seen, over the last 20 years, when people left, that's where they finally felt happy. When they were just changing roles within the same company, there was still this minor anxiety that they still felt, and they can never truly be their best self.
Yeah, I agree. There's something that really happens within our own minds at that point where it's like we just can't fully break free. Sometimes you need that.
It's like you have to press the reset button. It's like you have to press the reset button.
Yeah,
pressing the pause button, and then it just, at some point, it's going to start playing again if you're in the same environment.
I agree. And then you're also then in this state of that for that period of time too, of almost waiting to see if it's getting better. And then any little thing that comes up, worried that it's, maybe it's not. And then the challenge with that is pretty soon you've done that for 2 years when you could have been out seeking that progress instead of looking over your back. So I would say for me, in that scenario, I think, as you said, oftentimes you're not going to change that. And that's why, to keep on theme with Game of Thrones for this particular one, I would say if your office is looking more like a battlefield, than a place of work. It's time to, find your dragon and fly away.
Fly away.
I do think that people should get out of the toxic workplaces as quickly as they can, because I think, well, I completely understand where you came from. And that's probably what I would initially tell somebody who was in there is, okay, let's try this and see if you can do it. But you're delaying the inevitable normally.
And then I think a distinction we should draw here is toxic could be, is there some things going on that are borderline illegal? That we're not touching on. That if there's some things going on that are illegal or borderline illegal, you gotta go. That's a different scenario. But we're mainly talking about just that toxicity of politics and communication sucks, and everybody is just out for themselves and doesn't feel like a team. That's mainly what we're focusing on. But if you're being harassed, it's time that you got to make a move on something.
Yeah, let's actually the one I want to jump to next, and just because you mentioned the thing about ethics, for lack of a better way to put it. So I want to jump to the other one that we have where we're keeping it themed to entertainment here, and this is the one that we had called Matrix situation, and ultimately in this scenario, this is one where it's like, okay, somebody has the choice where they have to consider whether or not it's a red pill or a blue pill moment. And this Matrix moment, which is basically aka a value alignment check, is where you do realize that the way that you want to operate and go about your day to day is misaligned with the company that you work with. So just a few examples would be work-life balance. For people who are like expecting to be able to go home at the end of the day and be done with their work, well, if they happen to work for a company or a boss who's like, no, we're on until 11 o'clock at night and you better be back on again at 6 a.m. in the morning, that might not be a fit. Diversity and inclusion would be another potential, conflict here. Social responsibility. And again, honing in on what you just said, that starts to fit into ethics, and where there's things that people are breaking the law or otherwise making somebody extremely uncomfortable. Is there anything else for the Matrix moment that I left out that you would think about when it comes to kind of value alignment check?
No, but maybe, I'm not sure how many, but for those that might not have seen the Matrix series, maybe explain what the movie was about.
Sure. Well, we'll just say this, because Matrix people were living in this whole other world, basically entrapped, we'll just call it, in little cocoons by the machines. And in this scenario, though, people were not aware, basically, of this other life that they could live, because they were so entrapped in this particular life that this is just what they know. And this was the reality that they assumed they needed to live. But there was also this key moment where, you had to choose to take the red or the blue pill, because as soon as the lead character, Neo, decided to take the appropriate pill, it was going to then send him in a place where he was making a decision for his own future versus letting the machines make the decision for him. So it's really a matter of being in an environment that you might make excuses for yourself and be like, well, this is just my life, but then realizing that you can make a different choice and leap to something new.
Yeah. And what the just said is so critical. Making your own decisions and being able to make decisions that impact your path, whether it's good or bad, but at least you're in control of making the decisions. That feeling alone, you feel like you're in control of your career. So if you have to get in a place where at least you have that feeling that you're in control, that it's not this bigger, the Matrix that's controlling every move you make and kind of puppeteering your moves. To me, that was always a critical thing. I always wanted to feel like I'm in control, even though in reality, maybe the control was little because there's so many things that I have no control over. But just feeling like I have a little bit of control gave me hope. And when I had hope, it made me a more pleasant, happier person. And when I was a more pleasant, happier person, I was a more productive person. So it kind of is a domino effect.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think what's really important though is for people to have a sense of what is important for them and the values. Because look, some people may laugh and be like, well, yeah, obviously, if the company is, doing something that's not ethical, then you should get out of there. But guess what? There's so many companies where things aren't being done ethically and people still stay there because, again, they may feel some other camaraderie that exists within another component of, or the people that they work with there, or they may feel like, well, I don't want to leave my friends, or they may just feel like, look, it's a paycheck and that's safety to it. And it's kind of like I'm going blank on the movie, the one that had to do with the whole 2008 crash.
The Big Short.
Yeah, Big Short. So in there, it's like you look at how many people, like that's a perfect one to, for anybody to look at, where you can see that there are so many people in here who are like, yeah, but this is wrong. But other people are like, hey, but everybody's doing it. So it's so crazy how quickly you could, fall into that. And just a specific example I'm talking about in there, a lot of it was around the lines of, are you really going to, allow somebody to have a loan that they can't afford in this sort of way? It's like, that's not really right. It's going to come back and catch them. Not my problem. Like, I'll sell it to someone else before they know, Anyway, so I think it ends up happening and people don't expect it to happen. In fact, there was this study I had read once that I really appreciated. I can't remember where it's from now, but the idea is that in the workplace, if you leave a soda in the fridge, in fact, if there's multiple sodas, people are more likely to come by and just grab a soda out because there's multiple ones. Who's going to miss one soda? Now, if it turns out that there's one soda in there, they're less likely to, but still somebody is likely to do it. They may look behind them, but they'll still likely do it. Now, if instead you leave in there a dollar bill, most people are like, well, I'm not going to take that dollar bill because that dollar bill must belong to someone, even though it's in the refrigerator. But the point is that people in our brains, we make these excuses for ourselves when things are removed from what feels like us doing the wrong deed. So when you get closer to that dollar bill, now that feels like, whoa, that's stealing. But a soda's not stealing because it could be anybody's. And anyway, and so it's just funny how our brains justify. And I think that's why things in workplaces can turn ethically unsound, but so many other people could just be like, that's just work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the herd mentality, I think, is kind of what you're talking about. So where it's easy to just follow the herd because if everybody else is doing it, then it's okay. And that's where, whether it's good leadership or bad leadership comes into play too, because if somebody is leading the way and everybody's following, well, you can look around and say, okay, well, everybody's doing it too. I should do it too. But it could be a bad thing that you shouldn't follow, but you do it just because everybody else is doing it. And that, usually from what I've seen, always comes back to bite you in the butt.
Yeah, I agree. Now, I think there are some things here that maybe aren't as, drastic as these. So one of the examples I had mentioned was, social responsibility. And in that case, look, somebody may just want to work at a company that's more green, for example, because that aligns with their beliefs and values. And if so, again, once more, I think that's important for somebody to decide if that is something that's going to, give them less anxiety, make them feel better about their role in the world. So I do think some scenarios like that, and there could be other things, socially. I mean, that's why a lot of people are attracted to certain companies that lean in, towards specific causes. And what can happen a lot for people is they'll go through interviews, and during the interview, people always talk about the interviewee, the person interviewing. They always talk about that person maybe, skirting the truth a little bit, writing on there. Then, oh yeah, no, I have experience in, what do you call it? I'm a ninja in Google Sheets. And it's like, they've never used them before, or they took a quick little course beforehand. But employers do it a lot as well. And when they're interviewing, it's easy for them to also be like, oh no, this place, it's so wonderful and you really want to be here. And in the back of their mind, they're like, I need to fill this role. I need this person in the world, whatever. Hopefully it'll be a year before they realize how bad the culture really is. So sometimes you find out these things after you've joined the company. And it's really important to be able to, again, once more, assess on your values, make decisions based on your values. But in order to do that, somebody needs to take time to actually write down what's important to them. And I think not enough people do that. Not enough people know. And it's almost like every employer they have is almost like somebody they're dating, and they're trying to figure out what they might want, in life. And hey, if that's how you have to figure it out, that's okay. Otherwise, really just taking that moment. I admit I may have done what I'm about to describe in the dating field once, where you make your list of, here is what my perfect companion looks like. But it's like, figure that out, capture it so that you have a better sense when you go in. And maybe some of them you're willing to, compromise on, but you got to know what you're not willing to compromise on.
Yeah. I think this goes to how they culturally, especially the latest generations. I could, even though I'm not a millennial, I think you and I are kind of in the border of being millennial, but I do feel like my thinking is very aligned with the millennial generation. And then even after, where purpose becomes a key factor, like feeling like you're doing something that has purpose. And that's why when I hear stories of, and it's all stories, anecdotal, I don't know, but you hear about Tesla or SpaceX and anything that Elon Musk is involved in, and how it's pretty, what's the word? Hardcore. I think he uses the word hardcore. Like, his work environments are hardcore, but people put up with it because they bought into the cause and the purpose. And I could see that. I could totally see myself falling into that, because if I truly believed in Tesla's cause or SpaceX's cause, I would, just be blindsided by some of the other things. I'll put a blind eye on and say, that stuff that, I'm hearing in the news and I'm seeing myself, I don't care about. But that's a decision you have to make, which is more important to you.
Absolutely. So if somebody's having a matrix moment, what do you recommend to them?
I think going back to what you said, just taking a step back, writing down, what is that I really want from a workplace? Take salary and title out of the equation. Everything else, what is that I want? And then if your matrix is nowhere close to what you've written on paper, it's time to leave, because it's going to be very difficult to change it. You're not going to be able to impact the culture the way you think. You're not going to be able to impact everybody's communication style, the people's leadership style, which is tied to a call. You're not going to change that overnight. So you just got to press the reset button and move on.
Yeah, I'll agree with you. I think in those few scenarios where, there might be something where there is that conversation around things like work-life balance, or if it looks like there's a diversity and inclusion issue, and you're seeing that that's gonna, stop. For example, your female and all the leadership's, male, and your even question or hint about, hey, so what about females in leadership? It gets met with chuckles. Then you're not. That's not the environment for you. Now, some people may see that and be like, oh, I will show them. It will be, whatever, however that, looks for them. But the idea is I think for the most part, aside from a basic conversation trying to address, see how that's met. And if it's met with the, again, chuckles, laughing, then that's a really good sign that that's not the right environment for you. And again, with what you said, I think this is usually one of those situations where your gut is usually right, and it's time to,
very true.
Get in.
And and some of this could get very complicated too. Like, speaking of diversity and inclusion, because it might be something that you care about, but something that I cared about always. But then when it looks like the companies are just checking off a box just to say they are, a diverse and inclusive place, then actually a person that cares about diversity and inclusion could rub them the wrong way. Because you're like, wait a minute, you're just doing these things to just check off a box. You don't actually believe in it. And that could be kind of the opposite effect of what you were hoping for. So it's complicated, but if you're really honest with yourself and what you really want out of your career and workplace, you'll eventually find it. But you just have to be very honest with yourself.
Absolutely. Great point. The next one I want to move on to is another moment. This is the Kodak moment, and not necessarily just the one somebody's thinking of snapping that picture together with a loved one. our friend, but rather Kodak moment is when you're in a stagnant or declining industry or company. So if you think about, Kodak's story, this was a company that was obviously leading maker of film. Them and Fuji out there had made film, but also when it came to just cameras in general, it's like, it was called a Kodak moment because every time you took a picture, you were snapping your memory onto film. But along the way, industry started to change. Kodak actually was one of the first companies that was really in to the new technology that was going to allow for these digital cameras. But they decided to kind of bury that and not go that direction because that would have eaten into their film sales. So
they invented the first digital camera in 1975.
That's crazy. Yeah,
Which
no,
is
exactly.
crazy to think how long ago they had the technology, but they buried it, as you said, because they were scared that it's going to eat into their revenue. So they were protecting the status quo versus thinking long term and innovation, and then didn't work out well for them because Kodak is a bankrupt company now, and I think all they do is just sell their IP or license their IP.
Yeah. No, and I think you just put that in a great way. It's like when a company gets there, and actually we'll talk about a department in a minute because we've broken that one out separately. But when that's happening, it is you're slowly burying yourself in your own grave, unfortunately. And there's different reasons why at the time it's a struggle for people to see it. And I think right now, as AI comes on quickly, it's another big question about what we'll face because, this is where companies, they don't want to innovate. They don't want to grow. They look at it and they say, look, this has worked for us for years. Don't change what's worked. And it's like, well, that's true. It might have. But if you don't stay a step ahead, then, you could also call this probably a Blockbuster moment because that's what happened to Blockbuster as well when they eventually pivoted way too late in the game. So if you're working at a company where they're still stuck in this era of disposable cameras while the rest of the world has moved on to, augmented reality, AI, smartphone photography, that's really a clear sign. And I don't know, Artin, if you had any examples that came to mind of where you've seen this or any experience in this Kodak moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I are very close to this, where the Blockbuster example of seeing how not only Blockbuster, but then the studios themselves were very late in the game because Netflix just caught both of them off guard. And even though the writing was on the wall, they just didn't want to disrupt their cash cow, which was the DVD Blu-ray business, 10, 15 years ago now, I think was at its height. And at the end, what happened? Both Blockbuster went out of business and, we were maybe just out of the streaming wars just because everything's going on. But Netflix, I think, is still the only profitable streaming business, while every other studio is struggling to find the model that works for them because they're so attached to their legacy businesses as well. So it becomes very complicated. So yeah, I would say you and I are very close to this, especially you having spent time at Disney, legacy, and at Netflix, the new. So it's very interesting to see how these things evolve. And that example, I feel like, exists in every industry. There's always legacy trying to hold on. The new kid on the block just pushes things forward and disrupts. And I think that's where, when we talk entrepreneurship, disruption is such a key part of the pie. If you're able to disrupt an industry, you pretty have a good chance of making it.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. That when you share that, it brought up this other story, and I'm trying to remember the exact locations. And again, as always, I'll probably slightly embellish or tweak some of the story. But there was a long ago, LA is not really known for having a great transportation, public transportation system. They've added subway, stuff like that, but I forget when it was, in the years 50s or something like that. There was actually a train that was built that connected perpendicular, went across, the valleys and into the cities. I think Chandler might be one of the locations, Chandler Way, which is now a bike path, was one of those locations. And anyway, then I think it reached down the other direction to the beach. But what had happened is at that point, I think it was like one of the tire companies, gasoline companies, maybe automotive companies all came in and basically said, well, let's buy it out. And people thought, oh, great progress. But no, they bought it out so that they could stop it from, cutting into their earnings, for that day. So it's like oftentimes, again, there may be mischief at play as people are just looking to protect their bottom line. But if you only think about it, in fact, I think in the same way that companies can think about their bottom line today, I actually think a lot of employees, I know this is probably a sidebar, but a lot of employees, I think, do the same thing. They're so focused on today that too many individuals aren't actually thinking about tomorrow and their future and how they need to innovate. So that's something that I can, not what we need to talk about, maybe we should in the future, but that is so critical for me because an individual themselves can be having their own Kodak moment if they're not actually thinking about how they need to grow and innovate for the future ahead of them.
Very true. Very true.
And I think with that, as we talk about careers being impacted by AI, because that could be one of those perfect, examples. Well, right now, this is why those, people ask, will AI take my job? No. Your job is going to be taken by somebody using AI. So if you're not leaning into leveraging AI, then that's where you have a greater likelihood of that happening to you. So actually, one more thing too, because I know you had mentioned this earlier when we were talking, things like DVD is another good example here. DVD today, like heck, my kids are probably, they know, they've seen them, but like they wouldn't know when you say DVD, Blu-ray, they wouldn't know really the difference between these. A VHS, they would not really understand. And these are things at different times that if they didn't innovate, like you and I moved into the industry when VHS was, starting to, it was actually at its peak, but everybody saw the potential of DVD, and Laserdisc was like somewhere in the middle of those. And that brought billions to studios in the industries, and not just them, but other industries who then started selling informational products and stuff like that. Like it revolutionized it. And once more, then everybody had to look at that. And even though, like for us, when we were still, you were leading the way with the move into iTunes and stuff like that in the future. And like in that scenario, it's almost like, like I was exhausting just because we're like, but we just went through these other ones. We got to do it again. But if you did it, then you're leaving all of that money on the table, and you just aren't innovating to a future. And I mean, imagine if you still had a company today like Disney who refused to sell anything other than their VHS, and they're like, we will only sell, VHS. Anyway, what do you recommend for somebody who's in a company and experiencing that sort of Kodak moment?
Oh, it's for sure. It's time to go. You're just you're kind of a dead man walking at this point. You got to make a change because you're just going to go down with the company or the department. Yeah. But it's time for change. You always want to be. You want to be. Again, I know it's easier said than done, but you want to position yourself in areas that are on the uptrend, not the downtrend, because when things are in the downtrend, is usually cost cutting. The mindset is very different. It's not about growth; it's about contraction. So, but when something is on an upward trajectory, it's about growth, opportunity. The promotions will come your way. So you definitely want to position yourself in an area that's trending up, not trending down.
Yep, absolutely. Follow the growth of the dollars. And I think that leads us well into this next one, which is, titled Pawnee's Struggle, aka a stagnant department. So for those not familiar with it,
what was that again? What is Pawnee's again? I don't think I watch. Yeah. I don't watch Parks and Recreation. So what is Pawnee?
So Pawnee, Indiana, is the fictional town where this Parks and Recreation department is, and I think a lot of Park and Recreation department either, in some cases, think how dare they paint us that way, but in other ways, I think some are like, yeah, no, that's pretty accurate. It's so hard for us to get any of the resources and things that we need to be able to support the Parks and Recreations group. And this is pretty much the comedy in this show is while this division seems to be wilting away, and they continue to try to strive because you've got some people in the department who would love to get noticed and get the Pawnee's Parks department out there, but they're just battling to secure support and financial backing. And in that scenario, or rather to mirror that, there's a lot of workplaces that will face that as well. And you and I, and even our experience, what we have found is sometimes when you're in the departments, like even an operations department, whose job is simply to fulfill the thing. I mean, we could take it back to DVDs again. Or actually, it's easier to even think about it VHS. When that story I was just mentioning, that transition. Well, when you're moving into DVDs, okay, great. Now you're moving into that future scenario bit there. But when you're the group whose job is now to just make sure that the VHSs, because people are still buying them, sure, it'll go away one day, but your job is to keep that department afloat. This is, in this situation, what we refer to as Pawnee's struggle.
Yep. I think just, we're talking about entertainment a lot here just because that's where we've spent a lot of our careers in. But all the conversation now around the legacy, like linear broadcast TV business, and how studios are struggling balancing that business versus the new streaming over the top business. That's a perfect example, probably bigger than the VHS example you mentioned, but it's a similar scenario where they need to keep that legacy business afloat because they can't just shut it off. If it shuts off, there's billions of dollars on the table. But then the transition to the new is difficult. It's such an interesting place. And, I follow this pretty regularly and closely. And, hearing about Bob Iger, Disney CEO, now considering selling some of that linear broadcast channels. And what will that mean? If I was still at Disney, I would start thinking about, okay, what happens if he actually pulls it off and sells the legacy business? Do I stay where I'm at because then maybe I'm now part of a new company? Or do I move myself into the growth area, the streaming, so I can actually ride the wave there? So it's a very interesting strategic area that you have to kind of play in, since Bob Iger has signaled this is potentially going to happen. So how do you position yourself? And that becomes a whole strategy that you have to draw for yourself.
Yeah, look, it's a great point. And once more, for me, it's one of the things where I would typically say to someone like, gosh, if you see a situation like that and you know that somebody's trying to unload something, possibly even at that discount because they realize they have to discount it because of where it's going in the future, I wouldn't want to personally stay with that. But again, it's difficult when that might be where we've put in several years of our lives, or that's just, what we know. But I think that if you're trying to position your career for growth, more promotions, more raises, then I think you really do need to consider a situation like that and be like, whoa, okay, the writing's on the wall. Who am I fooling here? It's time for me to try to make that pivot towards a department. Because it might even be staying, for example, with your Disney, there might be people in broadcast who are like, well, look, I still want to be at this company. So let me now try to move over to another division. The skills that I have, how can I start transferring those? And really think about the pivot in that scenario versus thinking, well, this is a skill I know. I'm going down with this, ship. I do think that there is a possible exception to this, but there has to be the appetite, and that's where it's a rescue situation. And I think you and I had some experience with these at different points. I definitely had several of them at Disney because was brought in to lead operations groups, and sometimes operations groups that weren't they were cost centers, or they weren't profitable profit centers. And the question then started becoming, can they be made such? And that's where I was able to take stories in these cases and basically turn around from that group that makes zero money and loses $1 million a year to the group that's making the company $3 million in basically value versus if they had to outsource and pay somebody else to do that work. And I think if people could do some of those, then they're in a good situation. But they have to keep in mind that usually once they do that, they've now done it. And now it's time to move on to the next one, because now if you just sit there, you're just once more back in the same thing where you're probably writing out the inevitable. And especially because sometimes you've got to get really creative about what you might want to do in that company. And the company may not want to go that route because it doesn't feel core to the business.
Yeah. And, you know, no matter what situation you're in, there's one way to future-proof yourself, no matter if you're in a declining area that might be sold off or you're at one of it, is to be the leader that is adding value or to be seen as that future leader.
Yeah.
If you are seen like as a leader or a future leader that's going to provide tons of value, it actually doesn't even matter what department you're in, because you're going to end up in the right place leading the way.
Yeah. I will just add to that. I'm with you in spirit. I do think where it still matters is, and you did more or less say this, but the person has to make sure that they're still getting seen by the other individuals, so that when their ship goes down, if their boss isn't so savvy about navigating it, that the other bosses in the other groups are like, we got to scoop Artin up because he's amazing. You see what he's done over there? We're not going to lose him. And again, I think that's ultimately what you're saying, but I want to just distinguish that, because there are some individuals who could blind themselves to that and think that they're that, because the majority of people think they're top performers when in fact they're not. All right. So one more left here that I wanted to talk about, and that was the Groundhog Day, AKA the lack of growth opportunities. And it can fit a little bit in with what we just mentioned, but ultimately this one hones from, the hilarious movie called Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. If you haven't watched it, watch it. The character is stuck in a loop, excuse me, and he's ultimately repeating the same day over and over again. So if your job feels like you're stuck in the same cycle with very little opportunity, and that, you're not finding yourself being able to grow and feel like you're actually making progress, it's probably trying to break that loop and find a new opportunity. Artin, what is your experience with this sort of Groundhog Day and lack of growth opportunities?
I definitely felt this in the past. I always tried to find my way out of it, instead of relying on others to get me out of the same day. And that I did that by looking for new opportunities, taking on new responsibilities, challenges, just to change things up. And one way that I also did that was tackling a side hustle, right? Significant big side hustle. Because if things felt stagnant and just repetitive and not fun during the day, at least I knew that nights and weekends, I had this other thing that I was very excited about. So the Groundhog Day aspect of the day job didn't bother me as much. So I always made sure that I never felt that way. To me, that was death. If I was in the same loop, it was like, shoot me right now. But I made it an initiative to get me out of that loop, whether it was looking for other opportunities or just finding my own opportunities outside to keep me engaged, to keep me learning, to keep me growing. Because I had to feel that. I mean, I'm still the same way. I have to feel that I'm moving forward. And if I feel it, now feeling and reality are obviously a different thing. I just have to feel it. And then when I feel it, then it slowly becomes reality too, because I take the right action to make it happen.
I strongly relate to everything that you just said. I feel I've approached things in a very similar pathway. And obviously, I think with our friendship, there's a lot of that because we're constantly pushing ourselves or each other to grow and be better, because otherwise we feel stagnant. We don't like that. And I think that's an important quality, actually, because what we found, and there may be some exceptions to this, but usually what I find is most people tend to actually shy away from some of those growth opportunities. We were always looking for those individuals who are hungry enough that we could be like, sweet, you're interested in this, or you want to learn this or do this project? We got it for you. Let's do it, because we were trying to always innovate and push forward. And when a lot of people just want to do the status quo and get it done, it sometimes does require somebody to then figure out how they're going to carve out extra time. But that to some people could feel like work. Whereas for us, finding those growth opportunities is what continue to position us for those next roles. Now, if some people are truly in a group where they're trying and they constantly are saying, hey, I would like to learn more, what can I do? And truly the answer back is no, just keep doing your job. Then you probably need to get out of there. But I have to say, I've rarely found those. I do think, some situations, trying to think of some leaders we've worked with in the past. I think there was one named Mark, who was a little bit more like, well, this is how we do things over here. And I do think he wanted the team members to do that role and get really good at just doing that role. And again, I think that's a struggle for a lot of people who, honestly, I think a lot of top performers usually are very entrepreneur, and they're constantly looking at how they can be entrepreneurs in the workplace. And I think that's a huge quality. But I think this one usually falls back on that individual because, as you said, even if the company doesn't have much for you at the time, this is when you could look at your growth through your side hustles. This is where, if you really are that hungry, you should be looking at external roles to then go and be able to pursue and continue to grow, because that growth then leads to the progress, and the progress is usually what makes us happier as human beings. So I think that's it. I mean, your recommendation on this one, just to be clear, should somebody stay or should they go?
No, I totally echo what you said. If it feels like you're trying but nothing's happening, it's time to make a move. But you shouldn't wait a year. At least as you're waiting a year to see if you're gonna get traction, definitely pursue that side hustle. Start, looking for other roles. Don't wait. Take some action on the side just so you can feel that progress.
Yeah. It's funny. I used to joke and say that I was lazy in the workplace, so I was always looking for ways to automate and streamline things, because then I could just sit back and relax. Truth is, never was sitting back and relaxing, because every time you do that, more comes your way. But I do remember plenty of time when you and I were working on screenplays, it's like part of our job, we could, in essence, get our job, I don't want to call it an autopilot, but we came up with really, really good ways to be able to streamline that work, with the idea in our minds oftentimes that, well, hey, with that extra time, then we can continue to make sure we can focus on our side hustle. When I say extra time is relative. Sometimes it's extra time. Sure, maybe it was during the day, and maybe you squeezed a little bit more extended lunch or whatever it was. Or maybe it meant that now it's not eating into your time after work or whatever it is, or, hours wise. But I think that for me, in people who have that mentality of constantly looking for how they can do something better, there's unlimited growth potential, because there's always something coming your way. If anything, you then just have to prioritize which opportunity you want to do next. All right. So that is the five sort of, categories we've come up with. If anybody has any other ideas, we'd love to hear them below, and maybe we could profile more of those later. I'm sure there's some more nuances, but, just to summarize, you can waste years, of your life in a dead-end opportunity. In fact, I shouldn't even call that opportunity. Let's just say you can waste years of your life in a dead-end job. But ultimately, why would you do that? You want to watch out for these warning signs that we shared. Listen to this again if any of them are fuzzy, or if you need some more clarity around them. Again, ask questions below, but you need to take action that moves you closer to where you want to be, not just where you currently think you are comfortable. And remember that friends don't let friends get stuck in dead-end jobs. So please reshare this episode with your friends so that they can do their own audit around it. And once more, if we left anything off, please let us know below.
Yeah, and don't forget to subscribe and follow.